Academic Standard Philosophy course. Hi, everyone.
Today, we will follow another path to modern times.
Another path?
Even when Kant argued that the prescription of things lies on the subject's side as Copernican revolution, Kant and subsequent philosophers believed in the existence of a common world as ever.
So, they found there the room for freedom, didn't they?
However, German idealism and historical materialism were not the only options to find freedom. Some doubted that the worldview itself may be arbitrary, and they thought that, in fact, there is nothing beyond us, neither meaning nor reason.
Aha, that was nihilism, right?
When Napoleon occupied Germany in 1805, Schopenhauer's father, a Hamburg trading company manager, committed suicide. His families were torn apart, and his assets were lost. He studied under the famous Ph.D. at Berlin University, but was disappointed. Even that Napoleon was gone. Everything disappeared like illusions. So, Schopenhauer inquired about the reason of the world, in his thesis of 1813, and analyzed it, into four. Part of existence, cause of generation, evidence of recognition, and purpose of action.
He lived in a time of great change.
The restorative Vienna system began, and the German petit bourgeoisie became interested in Indian culture, particularly with imported Indian cotton fabrics, reflecting the simple Biedermeier taste. Schopenhauer was also fascinated by Indian philosophy. It taught that, although we humans were originally one, with the universe as Brahman, now divided and confined individually, in each Atman, by the veil of Maya, the private illusions. This idea led him to be negative, against Kant's subjectivity.
He might be a precursor to Beethoven and Feuerbach.
The false Maya is created by oneself, with the will to live as oneself, although without knowing what oneself truly is. It meant the denial of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, based on self-identity. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Projection, in 1818. In it, he argued that our dependence on consistent rationality is the root cause of all problems.
It was slightly before Hegel became a professor at Berlin University. His book would get him into trouble.
First, he reconsidered the former four reason principles. The part of existence is just the consistency, so it does not certify the existence. The cause of generation rather belongs to the subjectivity. The evidence of recognition is a mistake in applying causality between the evidence and subjectivity. Thus, only the purpose of action remains. However, purpose precedes reality, by subjective will. So, in practice, we always have to take action, as a leap without knowing the actual result.
Kant found there the room for freedom.
Second, he demonstrated that the worldview is comprised of wills in discord. Based on one's own will, the subject precedingly fabricates an illusory world. Within it, the body is the avatar of one's will. One sets concrete purposes, without knowing why one wants them. However, the illusory world becomes the battlefield of wills against wills, because everything has an unfamiliar will, behind each body, from stones to states. Blocked by the struggle, no will can realize its own want.
Having one's own avatar fight in the fictional world is just like a game.
However, third, these wills are in fact the same one, just as even many branches have the same trunk. Then, why do we have to suffer the struggle of wills? It was because our worldviews are distorted by our own private wills, in the first place. So, we need to cognize the true figure of the world, through intuition. The way is art. An artist intuits the world, and represents it in his works. The real world has its own will independent of us. So, even if the arts reveal the real world, our private wills still fail.
Indeed, he was a romantic, like Schleiermacher Beethoven, but he saw art as nothing more than a temporary consolation.
Therefore, fourth, we should annihilate our private wills themselves. Schopenhauer thought, wealth and poverty, even life and death, all private wills to live are meaningless, because after all, they belong to the same world will, and the struggle for living is nonsense too. As many religions say, when one abandons the private will to live, one can get peace of mind.
After all, did he also think like Hegelians, that the world reason should rule everything?
However, Schopenhauer was actually a person far from such peace. He fought with his mother, raped his maid, and disputed with his publisher over this book. Although he barely became a private lecturer at Berlin University, he simultaneously set his lectures alongside Hegel, and was unable to attract any students. Thus, he was forgotten along with this book.
However, those who took up the issue of division among the modern people would read his book after that.
In contrast to the repressive German Vienna system, the Golden Age flourished in Denmark. It began with the architecture, in the Masonic neoclassical style of the rebuilt Copenhagen, and many sculptures followed to decorate it. The scientist Ørsted pioneered electromagnetism. Erlenschläger visited Berlin in 1705, and became acquainted with Goethe, Ph.D, and Humboldt, and wrote romantic poems and plays. His younger sister Sophie married Ørsted's younger brother, and her salon brought together many Danish intellectuals.
It was the beginning of the Golden Age of Denmark.
Studying Ph.D, Pastor Kronvi promoted Danish nationalism, based on Norse mythology and Lutheran Pietism, and popularized it, through new hymns and national schools. Andersen also began to write novels, and was successful with his original fairy tales. In philosophy, Hegelianism invaded and dominated. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer, who was largely forgotten in Germany, submitted an essay to the Royal Danish Academy, and enraged by being rejected, criticized the Academy.
As ever, Schopenhauer was far from peace.
A son of a wealthy merchant, Kierkegaard was sickly, and an incident that he called the Great Earthquake hit him in 1835. He sought the meaning of living his limited remaining life. He studied theology diligently to become a minister, fell in love with a girl, and was engaged to her. However, with anxiety about his future, he unilaterally broke off the engagement in 1841, and left for Berlin.
Those pancake-like lands have no earthquakes. His dizziness would be so awful that it gave him a premonition of death.
However, Berlin University did not meet his expectations. The old rector Schelling was nothing more than an expeller of Hegelians. Kierkegaard returned to Denmark, and published Either or under a false name in 1843. Considering marriage, the narrator concluded it is best not to marry and to keep changing partners, so as not to get bored. Against him, Judge William preached the common wonderfulness of marriage. Kierkegaard's point was not either or, but neither nor. Both aestheticism and speculativism thinking formally, miss the concrete individuals concerned.
It was his apology for breaking off the engagement. It may also have meant he had his praise neither in Denmark nor Germany.
Nevertheless, without knowing of his broken engagement, people misunderstood Kierkegaard as a traditional moralist recommending marriage, and pushed him into a popular writer. As the Danish Golden Age, various presses were issued. The journal Fædrelandet was the center of public opinion in Denmark. Kierkegaard also submitted many articles to it, and published some books, under pseudonyms for rhetorical purposes, expressing different life views.
Writing all this and that seems like a sign of his desperation.
Kierkegaard's physical condition got worse. His spine was curved, and his legs were of different lengths. He had to face his anxiety, and sought the cause, in sin, in the concept of anxiety in 1844. The term anxiety is derived from anchio, or nihil in Latin. Kierkegaard also regarded it as a sort of emptiness in human existence, so he examined it as a human morbid phenomenon.
Anxiety is an essential something missing. Kierkegaard would be against Schopenhauer's solution by the annihilation of private will.
Mind and body are originally one. But, taking something forbidden for the mind, Adam was torn between mind and body. It was the original sin of humans. Learning this myth makes mutual distrust between mind and body, namely, anxiety in cognition and practice. It may be alleviated by coincidental success, as inner dialectics within oneself. But which is merely temporal, and only leads to the next mind-body anxiety again.
For the unwell Kierkegaard, the disconnection between mind and body, which meant he was unable to move as he wanted, or feel as he was touched, would be a real problem.
But anxiety is just the possibility of sin. It also contains the chance of recovery. What we should be is defined in advance, in the providence of God. So, when we leap with faith for it, we can regain the unity of mind-body. However, as long as we are different in providence, what kind of consistency we should build in our own lives within it, is absolutely unique as single individuals. So, to return to eternal peace within Providence, we need to ask God, as qualitative dialectics with God.
Feuerbach regarded human universal essence as our home, while Kierkegaard thought that each of us returns to respective identity within God's world.
Based on this thought, Kierkegaard wrote Stages on Life's Way, in 1845, as the sequel to Either Or. Showing aestheticism and speculativism about marriage, as in the previous work, Kierkegaard added a fictional diary of two, who were engaged, but found their difference in their future. In short, his answer to neither nor was, the absolute single individuals.
To return to the nature of himself, he had to solve people's misunderstanding of the former book.
His old friend Mahler criticized his verbose style, in the review. Inflamed Kierkegaard exposed Mahler's ties to the notorious ironic paper Kurs Aaron, in the significant journal Federlanda, thereby crashing Mahler's chance at a professorship at Copenhagen University. The Kurs Aaron began an obstinate campaign to criticize Kierkegaard as a traitor to his friends, using teasing about his appearance. People also turned their backs on him and isolated him.
Indeed, making fun of his illness is awful, but Kierkegaard too was somewhat eccentric. Was that due to his worsening illness?
Kierkegaard was convinced that his illness would soon bring him to death, so he wrote The Sickness Unto Death. It was the detailed explanation of Band 4 of the former concept of anxiety. He replaced the term demonic with fortbibleelse. The word is often translated as despair, but in Danish, it means strong doubt, apostasy. It is the rejection of qualitative dialectics with God. Even if his life is consistent, but if it has no proper place in the providence, which makes his life meaningless nihil. That is a very fatal sickness.
Kierkegaard thought not of the consistency of life within oneself, but of the salvation in God's providence.
He first examined apostasy, from the form of the integration of the self. If he tries to integrate everything infinitely, his outer interest dilutes his life. In contrast, finite interest fills his life, with just a few trivial things. As well, when he is concerned about too many possibilities, which bereaves him of his reality. However, if he limits his life to inevitable things, he loses his self.
In the first place, it would be wrong for us to think we can decide for ourselves what we should do and not do.
So second, he considered apostasy, from the consciousness. It has three levels: unaware of apostasy, escaping into the worldly or from the heavenly, and rejection of God. Those who do not know that they are given their selves, are also not aware that they have thrown their selves away, and that they are against God. However, even if they are aware that they have their selves, they may not try to be their selves. They don't like their given selves, and try to imitate someone else successful. Or, they dare to try to be no one. Furthermore, the most serious apostasy is self-obsession. They reject all evaluation, even by God, discipline themselves, and never ask for anyone's help. But he is in fact an alone king without any land.
Yet there are a lot without their own wish, wearing shirts with others' names, hanging around despite their age, and running selfish businesses.
In the latter half of the book, he insisted that it is a sin of apostasy, not to be self, or to be a selfish self against providence. Knowing God's providence, apostates do so. Therefore, sin is positive, and belongs to the single individual. The sin is twofold: apostasy against self-responsibility, and apostasy against the forgiveness of God. The people of today are stumbling with indifference, bystanding, or refutation of God.
People are betraying both themselves and God.
Fearing oppression, he had divided the manuscript, and this was in fact just the former parts of it. As a result of the February Revolution of 1848 in France, the new Danish king was compelled to draft a constitution, which guaranteed religious freedom, and reorganized the state church into the national church. Kierkegaard published the sequel, As Practice in Christianity in 1850. Here, he criticized rational explanations, such as those of Hegelians, and asked people to take a qualitative leap into the paradoxical revelation. He also fought for reform in the Danish national church, but collapsed and died in the street, in 1855.
Was he an anachronist speaking of God, or a prophet of the future without God?
When Beethoven, who composed his Ninth Symphony in 1824, concentrated on profound string quartets and lost popularity, Rossini instead gained a reputation for light-hearted operas such as The Barber of Seville and William Tell, and a son of a wealthy banker, Meyerbeer followed him with spectacular grand operas. In debt, Wagner, of the same generation as Kierkegaard, came to Paris in 1839.
Why talk about musicians?
Wagner was not just a musician. Supported by Meyerbeer and given small jobs, he found that the stockbroker King Louis Philippe and his Jewish connections controlled France, and they also fabricated the popularity of music and novels, with money and newspapers. He became acquainted with Heine, Proudhon, and Feuerbach, and was influenced by them.
Heine also supported Marx after that, right?
In 1841, the Saxon kingdom newly built an opera house in Dresden, and invited Wagner as the conductor. However, despite being supported by Meyerbeer as ever, and being under the patronage of the court, he secretly spread anarchistic and anti-Semitic sympathizers there. When the March Revolution of 1848 broke out in various places in Germany, the Frankfurt National Assembly sought to unify Germany under the Prussian king with the constitution. Wagner invited the violent revolutionary Bakunin, and the anarchists also rose up in revolt, forcing the Saxon king to approve the constitution. However, the Prussian king rejected the plan, and the Frankfurt National Assembly fell apart. Wagner fled, and Bakunin was arrested and sent to Russia.
There are always young people who want to overthrow authority.
During his exile in Switzerland, Wagner deepened his understanding of art. According to him, art should be rooted in traditional lifestyles and the national spirit, and should be a synthesis of literature and music, play and dance. However, the arts of their time were corrupted by the popularity-seeking commercialism. This was because they were being controlled by Jews, outsiders of any nationality. He published these provocative ideas, anonymously in 1850. However, the circulation was small, and it didn't garner much attention.
Whatever they would have called them, Kierkegaard and Wagner questioned the modern masses who have become fraught with the Industrial Revolution and lost their original homelands and individualities.
Wagner was influenced by Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Projection. With it, he was convinced that art allows us to intuitively perceive the blind will, the true nature of the world. He was also fascinated by the old legend, the Song of the Nibelungs, that the German Romantics rediscovered, as the symbol of German national spirit, and planned to turn it into a grand musical drama. The medieval legend told of the adventure, marriage, and assassination of the hero Siegfried, so Wagner organized this into a trilogy, and set it within the grand schemes and failures of greedy gods. However, this concept was too big to be easily realized.
I wonder why the nationalist Wagner used Danish mythology. Was he influenced by Grundtvig?
After numerous affairs with women, Wagner became the favorite of the new gay King Ludwig II of Bavaria, in 1864. Under the new patronage, he republished his critique of Jewish art with his own name, and also began to build his own theater in Bayreuth. In 1866, a war broke out between the North German states led by Prussia, and the South German states led by Austria, with Prussia emerging victorious. Furthermore, including the South, Prussia fought against France in 1870, and it unified Germany as the Empire. In defeated France, Bakunin rushed to the scene, and people rose in revolt, attempting to establish commune governments in Lyon, Marseille, and Paris, but these were soon suppressed. Incorporated into the empire, King Ludwig II of Bavaria became obsessed with building anachronistic castles.
Prussia's victory was due to Bismarck's military red iron and broad policy.
In 1876, Wagner finally completed The Ring of the Nibelungs, and performed it at his own theater in Bayreuth. However, he adapted legends and myths, incorporating metaphors that critiqued the times. There were the Prussian king, the North and South German states that founded his empire, the Jews who stole the Rhine-Gold, and the German workers under the Jews' control. The king tricked the Jews and got the Rhine-Gold ring, with which he paid the states. A heroic grandson of the king, Siegfried, defeated the states and obtained the ring. A villain, the son of the Jews and France, assassinated Siegfried, and stole the ring, but Siegfried's wife retrieved it, and threw herself with it into the fire, burning the empire as well.
In short, did this imply that the heroic anarchists may have been defeated, but the musician Wagner retrieved the German national spirit and gave it back to the people?
A genius student of classics at Leipzig University, Nietzsche was appointed professor at Basel University, without a degree, in 1869. He was a great admirer of Shakespeare and Goethe, as well as a fan of Schopenhauer and Wagner. So, although neoclassicism had interpreted Greek culture as clear and intellectual, in 1872, he published the bold hypothesis that something dark and irrational lurked at the bottom, and that Greek tragedy was composed of the conflict between actors and choruses. However, he was severely criticized for lacking an empirical basis, and lost credibility as a scholar.
He would be in line with Wagner's idea of a total art.
Yeah, alienated from academia, Nietzsche expected Wagner to realize the idea, and often visited him. However, Wagner's snobism, surrounded by celebrities at the premiere of The Ring of the Nibelungs of 1876, disappointed him. Nietzsche had a misunderstanding of Wagner, from the beginning. Influenced by Schopenhauer, and driven by anti-Semitism, Wagner held the strange religious view, that German Christianity had evolved from Aryan Buddhism. Even before The Ring, he had conceived and begun composing a Christian festival play, Parzival.
In the end, Wagner just wanted to be pampered like the Jews.
Nietzsche's deteriorated health compelled him to leave Basel University in 1879. He was also mentally depressed, so he retreated to a small village in the Swiss mountains to rest. Around this time, he wrote down numerous aphorisms. He coldly considered that religion, philosophy, politics, etc., are all meaningless, and that these are delusional ideals that misery humans love to fabricate. He was a pessimistic nihilist.
Such people are often found among intellectuals.
However, after several years, Nietzsche found that nihil is the very truth of the world. He cried out, "God is dead." So, he wrote about the coming of a new age, in the allegorical myth, Zarathustra, in 1883. Zarathustra was originally an Iranian religious leader, but Nietzsche portrayed him as a prophet, telling the age beyond good and evil. After 10 years of reflection, Zarathustra descended the mountain to preach. According to Zarathustra, people kill gods, and say all sorts of things, thinking as if they become gods themselves. However, they're never the latest, but just at the end of the line, and in addition, there's nothing at the head of the line. Nietzsche invoked, "May the high stepper going over this empty earth be blessed."
Come to think of it, Shakespeare said, "Oh, the world is just a stage." Goethe also called Faust a high stepper and provokes him to go beyond good and evil.
However, Nietzsche quickly wrote the sequel. Realizing that people misunderstood him as just a demonic anarchist, Zarathustra again descended the mountain to explain the true arche based on the earth, the will to power. It is the origin of power to live and create for everything, and is the very true salvation of lives. Nevertheless, religion, philosophy, and politics fabricate ideals that don't exist, denying and depriving the power. But now again, we should affirm it.
Faust also died satisfied, thinking he had heard the sounds of people prowling the earth. However, Faust said to stay the time.
Yeah, the will to power never stops, so everything has to be overcome by the next thing. Therefore, Nietzsche went on to argue this problem, in part 3. Nothing lasts forever, and the meaningless repeats endlessly. This eternal return is the truth of the nihil world. However, a high stepper makes even the whole eternal return their own. Whatever the past vanished is what he wanted to throw, and whatever future to fade away is what he wants to repeat. He loves the non-stop fate, and rather lives with it eternally.
He would be the belly wheel to power.
However, as well as part 1, neither part 2 nor part 3 was nearly sold, and received no response. So in 1885, Nietzsche had Zarathustra engage in conversations with 9 successful celebrities, for himself as part 4. However, a prophet, 2 kings, a scholar, a magician, the last pope, the ugliest, the voluntary beggar, and his shadow were, all, in fact the needies, asking Zarathustra for some help. But Zarathustra, insisting on affirmation of life, by saying yes like a donkey, and shaking off his sympathy for the celebrities in the cave, decided to descend the mountain alone, and get to his own work, like farmers living on the land.
The beggar is Jesus, and the magician must be Wagner. However, I wonder who the others were. Anyway, arguing with the people in the cave wastes time.
Despite his deteriorating health, Nietzsche rewrote the theme of Zarathustra in aphorisms, arguments, and even academic style. Here, he redefined human nature to desire the fabrication of fictitious ideals, as ressentiment. The weak who cannot affirm their own lives, envy the strong, and plot the inversion of values, where they become the stronger. Actually, it was the Gilded Age of industrial capital tycoons. They rose from the humble, made their fortunes in steel, oil, and railroads, and ruled the world with their own rules. Nietzsche had a seizure in 1889, was imprisoned, and died in 1900, without knowing that his ideas were gaining attention.
However, he must have disliked his admirers the most.